I'm 78 years old, and I never thought I'd live long enough to see what people call success. Not really. People talk about it like it's a moment, a sudden rise, something you can point to. For me, it came like a whisper at the end of a long hall I didn't even know I was walking down. I didn't even recognize it when it first arrived. I grew up thinking life would have room for everything. Love, family, work, small joys, big dreams. But time has a way of shrinking space, of taking away more than it gives. Looking back, I see now how I traded pieces of myself for the illusions of safety and stability, and I can't get them back. In my 20s, I wanted to be practical. My parents had nothing when they were my age, and I didn't want to repeat their struggles. So I worked. I worked every odd job I could find. Clerical work, bookkeeping, office errands. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't thrilling. It was just steady. I believed steady meant security, and security meant respect. I remember walking to work in the early mornings, the streets empty, the smell of bread from the bakery on the corner. I liked those quiet walks, the rhythm of my own feet. But I didn't stop to think that maybe those minutes could have been more than a commute. There was always tomorrow, wasn't there? Always another chance to be someone I wanted to be. I married young, as many did in my circle. My husband was kind in a quiet way, dependable, though he never stirred me. I thought that mattered less than what we were building together. A home, a life, bills paid on time. I didn't realize that passion, the kind that lights you up from the inside, can't wait forever. Or maybe I did, but I told myself it would come, eventually. We had children, 2 of them. They were enough to fill every space in my day that wasn't work. And yet, I notice now, the more I filled my days, the emptier I felt. I missed their early confessions, the small things they said before school, the moments that seemed unremarkable at the time but were really everything. I thought I was doing right by them, but I was mostly doing what I thought was expected. Career-wise, I didn't aim for the top. I didn't even know what top meant in my line of work. I did my tasks, earned my pay, moved up slowly, always steady. Promotions came late. Recognition was a quiet thing that rarely touched my life. My younger colleagues would joke about climbing ladders, chasing titles, ambition burning in their veins. I smiled politely and told myself that I had different priorities. But inside, I was often lonely, even in the middle of family dinners and busy office days. I couldn't name it then. I thought everyone felt it. This quiet hollow that wasn't sadness exactly, just absence. Sometimes I would watch other people, younger, striving, glowing with the rush of it all, and wonder why I never had that spark. I chalked it up to temperament, to personality. I told myself, this is just how I am. I made mistakes too. Not the kind you read about in novels or movies. No dramatic betrayals or catastrophic failures. Just small, accumulating errors. Turning down an opportunity because it felt risky. Staying late at work when my child needed me. Choosing the safe option over the one that made my heart beat faster. Those choices seemed harmless, reasonable even, but they added up. The years blurred together. My 20s became 30s. 30s became 40s. And by then, I had convinced myself that perhaps I wasn't meant for anything remarkable. I busied myself with things that mattered on paper. Bills, home maintenance, social obligations. Every evening I would sit with a cup of tea, the quiet stretching around me, feeling both content and disappointed at the same time. I didn't have the words then, but I felt the slow thinning of my own life. I lost friends along the way, mostly to distance or divorce or simply life happening elsewhere. I would meet them again briefly at reunions or weddings and realize that we had nothing to say anymore. We had all grown around the lives we built, and I, more than most, had built walls of routine so high that few could climb them. I didn't notice the isolation creeping in. I only noticed the gaps when I felt them most, in the stillness of my apartment, in the evenings, when no one called and the air felt heavier than usual. I'll never forget one evening in my early 50s. I had stayed late at work yet again, buried in reports that no one would even remember in a year. I walked home under a cold rain, and the streetlights glinted off the wet asphalt. For some reason, I felt the weight of every choice I had made pressing down. I realized that success, as I had imagined it, had nothing to do with money or title. It had to do with presence, with living fully in the moments that really mattered. I didn't know how to fix it, not then. I only knew the ache. Looking back, I see now that life kept giving me chances, little windows that I ignored. A neighbor inviting me for coffee, a coworker suggesting a new project, a book that could have changed how I thought, but I let them pass. Always tomorrow, I told myself. There would be tomorrow. And then life happened as it always does. Years rolled over me. My children grew up, moved away. My husband died quietly in his sleep one night. No warning, no dramatic farewell. I remember standing in the kitchen, the morning light cutting across the tile floor, feeling both lost and oddly free. The weight of responsibility had lifted, but with it came the full measure of regret I had been carrying unacknowledged for decades. I was alone then, in the truest sense, and it was only in that solitude that I began to see the pieces of myself I had left behind. The ambitions, the curiosities, the laughter that belonged solely to me. I began to understand that success had always been waiting for me, quietly, in the corners of my life I had ignored, but it required time, patience, and losses I hadn't anticipated. By the time I finally understood, I was past 60. I started small, writing, taking on freelance work, exploring interests I had shelved for years. People began to notice, slowly. Recognition came gently, almost apologetically, as if the world had realized it had forgotten me for far too long. I could have been bitter. I could have refused to accept it. But I didn't. I was grateful, even with the ache that reminded me how late it had all arrived. I won't lie, it was a lonely success. Most of my peers had already celebrated their peaks and were moving on to retirement or grandchildren. I was late to the party, arriving quietly without fanfare. Yet I treasured it because it belonged to me finally in a way it never had before. I see now that life isn't measured in accolades or titles. Not really. It's measured in the quiet moments where you finally listen to yourself, in the choices that finally honor who you are. I wish I had learned that earlier, but I didn't. And that's part of the story too. The long stretch of not knowing, of waiting, of living half a life in careful duty rather than full presence. In my 60s, the shift became more real. I had more time than before, or at least I thought I did. Retirement was on the horizon, and for the first time in decades, I felt the gnawing question: what did I actually do with my life? I picked up small projects, writing articles, helping a friend with bookkeeping, but always cautiously. I was tentative, as if stepping too quickly might shatter the fragile sense of freedom I had finally begun to understand. My friends had settled into their golden years differently. Some traveled, some were surrounded by grandchildren. I had neither. I had only the echo of my own life, the quiet hum of days spent making up for decades of neglecting my own curiosity. I remember one afternoon, sitting at a library table with a pile of books around me. I had always loved stories, but work, family, duty, they had consumed every minute I could claim. Now I could finally read without guilt, take notes, sketch ideas, dream small. I felt a spark I hadn't known in years, maybe ever. And yet, I was painfully aware that these sparks had waited for too long. I had let decades slip by thinking survival was enough. I met people in this late chapter who were like me. Late bloomers, quiet achievers. Those who had waited until circumstance or loss forced them to acknowledge themselves. We shared a kind of understanding that younger people couldn't grasp. They didn't ask about my past choices. They only asked what I wanted to do now, and I told them honestly. I want to create, to contribute, to matter in a small way before I'm gone. The irony, of course, is that while my work began to gain recognition, my personal life remained sparse. Family ties were thin. My children had their own lives, full and complicated. We spoke on holidays and birthdays, but the closeness we might have had was gone, eroded slowly over years of prioritizing everything else over presence. I never resented them, never blamed them. I had been absent, and that absence is a hard thing to reconcile. There were moments of loneliness that cut sharply, even as I received small accolades, a magazine feature, a local award, or letters from people who appreciated my work. I realized how much of life I had missed. Friends I had neglected over decades were gone, and the windows to reconnect had closed. The recognition felt bittersweet because it arrived without the warmth of shared human connection that I craved. One day, at 70, I received a phone call from a former colleague I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. She congratulated me on a recent project. She said she had always known I was capable of great things, that it had just taken time for the world to notice. I laughed softly, a little bitter, a little grateful. I told her, it took me this long to notice too. And it was true. I had only just begun to see my own potential, even as the years were folding behind me like a shadow I could never chase down. I also discovered the quiet joy of teaching, sharing what I knew, mentoring younger people, guiding them through mistakes I had made. It brought a satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. But again, it was tinged with regret. I thought of all the years I could have done this, all the lives I could have influenced earlier. Had I not spent so long building a life that looked responsible on paper but felt hollow inside? Health became a new challenge in these years. My body reminded me that time was not limitless. Small aches, sudden colds, memory lapses. They arrived subtly, as if to warn me that every day I spent on delay was a day I couldn't reclaim. And yet these challenges also focused me. I couldn't waste energy on trivialities anymore. I had to choose carefully, decide what mattered most, even if it was already late to reclaim everything I had lost. Looking back, I understand now that success is not a single moment. For me, it was a gradual accumulation of small recognitions, personal growth, and finally self-acknowledgement. But it came wrapped in the quiet loneliness of lost time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a deep, reflective satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you finally noticed what matters, even if it is delayed. One winter evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching snow settle on the branches outside. I thought about all the birthdays I had missed fully appreciating, all the conversations I hadn't had, all the laughter left unshared. I felt sorrow, yes, but also a kind of acceptance. This is my life. Flawed, delayed, sometimes painfully quiet. But it is mine, and I am here to witness it, however late it arrived. I began to understand something crucial. The world doesn't owe you acknowledgement. People move on, priorities shift, life goes on without pause. What matters, I realized, is noticing yourself, choosing to act, and finally allowing yourself the dignity of being seen, even if it is after most others have stopped watching. By 75, I had gathered small successes. A book published, a project completed, emails of thanks from people I had taught or helped. Nothing monumental, nothing life-changing for the world. But for me, these were treasures I had not known I could claim. And yet, each one carried the echo of missed years, reminding me that success without shared experience can feel achingly solitary. Even as I write this now, at 78, I feel the weight of time. I am grateful for what I've achieved, but the gratitude is mixed with sorrow. The cost of delay is permanent, and no late recognition can ever replace what was quietly lost along the way. Friendships, family moments, youthful vigor. I carry those absences with me, alongside the small triumphs that finally came too late to soothe the long shadows.
Turning 76, I started to notice the silence in my apartment more sharply. It wasn't just the absence of people, though that was part of it. It was the absence of expectation, of responsibility, of constant motion that had defined my life for so long. I had traded the chaos of busyness for the stillness of solitude, and it was only now, fully, that I could see how late I had arrived at this stage. I spent a lot of time reflecting on the choices I had made, the life I had built, and the life I had postponed. I remembered my 40s and 50s vividly, not in grand moments, but in the small, almost imperceptible ways I had let myself slip away. I had always assumed there would be more time. There wasn't. My children called less frequently as their own lives became heavier. I understood that, I really did. But sometimes I would sit with the phone in my hand, feeling a hollow ache, wondering if they noticed my absence as much as I had noticed theirs. I never complained. I just felt it. It's a quiet, gnawing weight, realizing that your presence is no longer indispensable, that the threads you thought were strong enough to hold everything together have frayed quietly while you were busy being responsible. I also thought about the moments I could have taken for myself. The risks I never tried. The passions I had set aside. I had wanted to write, to explore, to create, but always in the future. Always after obligations, after bills, after someone else's needs. I had told myself, I'll have time later. But later doesn't arrive the way we imagine. It arrives quietly, wrapped in regrets and echoes of what might have been. Success, when it finally came, was like a soft light breaking through blinds I hadn't opened in decades. I had written a small book. It was modest, hardly anyone noticed, but it had been published. People wrote to me, thanking me for what I had shared. They said I had inspired them, though inspiration had never been my intention. I only wanted to speak honestly, to put down the pieces of my life that felt real. And yet, it was deeply rewarding, even if I did so largely alone. One evening a neighbor, an older man I had met just months earlier, knocked on my door. He had read my book and wanted to talk. We sat for hours discussing ideas, regrets, and the peculiar satisfaction of late success. He told me, "You did it. Finally, you found your moment." And I nodded, but I couldn't shake the lingering sense of missed opportunities. My success felt like a companion arriving after everyone else had gone to bed, carrying light that illuminated a room already filled with shadows. I began to notice my health more seriously at 77. Walking upstairs, bending to pick things off the floor, even short walks, reminded me that my body had limits. My mind was still sharp, surprisingly, but time was no longer patient. I realized that everything I had delayed, projects, friendships, experiences, was now compressed into a fraction of the years I once assumed I had. The pressure wasn't external. It was simply the clock ticking inside me, quiet and relentless. And still I kept moving forward. I took on small teaching assignments, local talks, and mentoring. I began connecting with younger people who reminded me of who I had once been. Eager, uncertain, full of potential. It gave me a strange satisfaction, knowing that even if my life had been late, my experience could still ripple outward. But each connection reminded me of what I had lost along the way. The deeper bonds that are formed over decades, the intimate friendships, the laughter shared in unhurried time. One afternoon, I found myself going through old letters, photographs, journals from my younger years. The faces of people I loved, moments I had forgotten, decisions I had made. They all stared back at me. I felt the weight of those years, the consequences of waiting, the accumulation of tiny choices that added up to a life partially postponed. The photographs smiled, unaware of the gaps that time had carved into my memory. Cried quietly. Not out of despair exactly, but out of recognition, finally seeing the whole picture, finally acknowledging what had been lost. And yet, even with all of this, I felt a cautious kind of pride. Not for what I had achieved by conventional standards, but for surviving, for enduring, for finally arriving at a place where I could recognize my own worth. Success had come late, yes, but it had arrived. And though it could never fully erase the past, it brought a measure of peace, the kind that only comes with honesty, reflection, and the courage to admit where life has gone differently than we imagined. There were still quiet evenings when the loneliness pressed in, when I thought of friends who had passed, of colleagues who had retired, of children far away. But now I sat with it differently. I acknowledged it, rather than denying it, and I let it be a companion rather than a tormentor. I realized that part of late success is learning to live with the losses, not trying to chase them down. I started writing more intentionally, not for fame, not for approval, but to leave a record, to speak truthfully about a life lived partially in delay. Some letters and essays reached others, people who felt similarly lost or late in their own paths. And when they wrote back, I felt a quiet connection, as if the years of waiting had been worth something beyond myself. It was subtle, not loud, not celebrated, but it was enough to remind me that even late success has its own quiet dignity. I have learned slowly that the cost of delay is permanent, but the gift of awareness is still possible. I cannot regain what I lost in my youth, the relationships, the time, the energy. But I can still choose how to spend the days I have left, and that, in its own quiet way, is a form of late success. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but deeply human. At 78, I sit in my small apartment and look around at the life I finally claimed for myself. It's not much. Just a few pieces of furniture, books stacked in corners, photographs of people and places that once mattered. But it's mine, and I see it with clear eyes now, unlike the haze of decades past. I have arrived at a quiet reckoning with both what I've gained and what I've lost. Success for me has never been a trophy, a title, or even money. It has been the acknowledgement that I finally listened to myself, that I finally acted, however late. But it comes with a weight that never fully lifts. I remember friends who laughed at ambition, colleagues who moved faster, family moments I let pass unappreciated. Those cannot be reclaimed. They are gone permanently, and that truth is part of my late success. The recognition that every choice has a cost, and some costs cannot be undone. I spend my days writing, speaking to small groups, mentoring young people who remind me of the me I once was. I feel a quiet satisfaction in their eyes when they grasp what I share. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it carries the echo of the life I could have had if I had begun earlier. Sometimes I wonder if my story might reach someone in their 30s or 40s, someone who is waiting, as I once waited, thinking the years ahead are endless. I want them to see that time matters, even if it doesn't always teach us that lesson gently. There are evenings when I sit by the window, tea in hand, thinking about the decades that slipped by. I think about my husband, long gone, and my children busy in their own lives. I think about myself, the choices I made in good faith, the life I built, the life I postponed. I feel sorrow, certainly, but also a kind of tender acceptance. This is my story. It arrived late, but it arrived nonetheless. I have learned that success without shared presence is bittersweet. I have learned that recognition from others is temporary, fleeting, and often irrelevant. What remains, what truly matters, is the quiet awareness that you finally did what you could with the time left. That's my gift, and it came at 78. There is gratitude, too, a gratitude mixed with regret. I am grateful for the small accomplishments, the recognition that finally arrived, the connections I can still make. But I regret the years I didn't take chances, the moments I let slip by thinking there would always be more time. Life never promises a second chance, and for decades I lived as if it did. Some nights, the silence presses heavily. The apartment is empty, the streets quiet. I feel the weight of years, of losses, of delayed joys. But I also feel the strength that comes from having endured, from having finally noticed, from having finally acted, even if it was late. There is a fragile peace in that, the kind that doesn't shout but simply sits with you in the evening light. If this story means anything, I hope it's this. Life can be late in giving you what you hoped for, but it can still give it. Not fully, not perfectly, and always at a cost, but enough to remind you who you are if you are willing to see. I do not speak to instruct or guide, only to share the truth of my days, the quiet accounting of decades, the weight of a success that came very late. I will not live forever. My hands tremble slightly now when I write. My steps are slower. My memory drifts in ways it didn't before. And yet I am here, and I can still see, still speak, still leave a record of the life I finally allowed myself to live. There is humility in this. There is sorrow. There is quiet joy. And there is the inevitability of what is to come. I am 78. I am late. But I am here. And in this late arrival I have found at last a measure of truth, a measure of dignity, a measure of myself. It is not enough to erase the past. It is not enough to fill the gaps of lost decades. But it is enough to sit with the knowledge that, finally, I am fully present. And that, in the end, is all I have.